Dennis Underwood, welcome to Paper Napkin Wisdom. I'm excited to have you here with me today.
Hey, I'm really excited to be here as well. And thank you for meeting me on Zoom.
Yeah. Hey, look, you sent an interesting paper napkin to me, and I'm going to read it out loud. I'm really looking forward to what it means because I think you chose the words carefully. So let me read it. Something awesome happens when the comforts and constraints of familiarity are stripped from a solution finding team. And I really think that you've added a couple extra words in there on purpose. So I will leave it to you. And Dennis, why did you share that with me?
The time of invention and the time of the initial research and development for our product and our company, it was done during COVID isolation times, and it was done when there was just so much upheaval with the world. I think that possibly nobody felt it more than some of our 20 somethings engineers who were suddenly alone and had a ton of creativity and were trying to find a way to both engage other people and have a belonging, but also they were already savants in their field. So they were already, I think, in some ways having that imposter syndrome and
Mhm.
wanting to provide value in a way that's already very difficult when you are a creative inventor in a society where we always envision the creative inventors to be uh, maybe more of a celebrity and sometimes more of like a gray beard, kind of like Victorian style inventor, right? And so all those together really contributed, I think, including some of my solution finding as CEO of a new company, since we had just pivoted a month before COVID isolation started. And so all that together created a very complex cocktail of emotions, of logistics, of academic research opportunities and challenges that I don't know if I'm going to see again, my next 40, 50 years of life on this earth.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you talked about this invention and creation during COVID and the savant character of some of your young experts. I had a really fascinating conversation about quiet experts, and we have to elevate quiet experts. And in this influencer mad world, and also like movies like Back to the Future with the mad flamboyant scientist who's really wow crazy, right? Like all of those things sort of come together to make us sort of think about what an expert looks like versus what one really is. And we have to find and almost excavate these quiet experts, these quiet scientists, these quiet brilliant minds, right? Is that sort of what you had to do? And then you had COVID on top of it, putting a gigantic blanket on top of it.
Right. Even in our interview strategy, I was, of course, a little bit older than the employees that I was interviewing. And uh, engineers, especially really good engineers, in many ways, are very high IQ, and sometimes the EQ hasn't quite caught up, right, or isn't quite there because they're busy trying to find solutions when everybody else was maybe out partying and fine tuning those social skills. They were, as savants do, they were hard at work at night, sometimes alone, sometimes just over social media, communicating with folks over Discord or something. And they were busy finding their art, right? And I think uh, part of what was going on was that those folks don't always, just like you talk about influencers. I have one child who's more of a introvert and one who's more of an extrovert. And if there's something wrong in the extrovert's world, you'll be the first one to know, and the whole world will suffer with them, or rejoice with them, right? And yeah, always have to watch the one who is a little more introverted, who might not have all those outward signs, that they're of what they're feeling inside, right? So that definitely was a component of this, and myself coming from an engineering background, who's learned to adapt a variety of extrovert like characteristics to achieve my goals, I had to be very, very cognizant of what that quiet engineer might be feeling, because it did have a direct demonstrable impact on the R&D and the creativeness that they were able to achieve.
Yeah. So I love how you talked about engineers finding their art, right? You said finding their art. I don't think people think about ones and zeros and software engineering as art, but I believe, and having experience in it, it's a hugely creative field. I mean, it is a canvas. Not all of us understand the canvas, but it is a canvas, right?
It is, the blessing for having the younger engineers coming on was that they didn't have the baggage of, like in my case, 20 years of practicing a skill and coming up with new ideas, because I had a lot of assumptions, right, that I bring to the inventing process. And for them, it was they had to get caught up on um, we'll say, on the baseline skills. But then I noticed that they did have a little bit more freedom because they weren't constrained. It's almost, what is it, in the Matrix, they talk about, the movie, how, oh, Neo was too old to leave the Matrix. He had too much baggage and assumptions. And what I learned and noticed was that the younger engineers were able to come up with more creative ways of expressing the engineering, and they didn't have as many assumptions to remove, but they definitely did have to approach things in a different way. That
Mhm.
a lot of times I think of it as if everyone is painting in one style, and then here comes Monet or someone else who, Van Gogh, who just paints in a completely different style, and they're like, "Is this guy insane?" And we had a little bit of that going on, where we had to break down, all of our known practices and then rebuild based off of something new we hadn't imagined yet, whether that, some version of an engineering cubism or something, and that's really what happened.
So it's interesting to me. And if we go back to the napkin a little bit, like one of the things you're talking about is, you know, you're talking about changing the constraints of this familiar way of doing things a little bit in your napkin, right? But you're talking about stripping them. So stripping uh, the constraints of familiarity is different than things just changing, right? And the pandemic, things changed, but you're talking about stripping the constraints of familiarity. What is the distinction that you're making there? What are you specifically talking about?
That's a really great point. Some of that removal of familiarity, of course, was simply due to macroeconomic global kind of changes, federal policy in the United States, things like that. So some of it was outside of my control. It's interesting to see how, in that world, I had a couple options that I could essentially thrust upon my employees, and then the band of engineers, we could, together, but then individually could decide to leave, to stay, or to see it through. Of course, many companies in that point, they chose to find some way of maintaining some level of normalcy, whatever that is, whether that was the Friday evening, cocktail hour over Zoom, which of course, we look, it was probably just as cringy then as it is now. And other times, I knew there were companies that just completely ignored the fact that there was this global pandemic, and they met, and then, they tried to go back to the office and maybe sit there next to each other with masks on or something. And I looked at the situation and I said, well, this is a unique time where I can make some decisions and lean into the disorder, to the discomfort, um, or I can try to find some way to have a semblance of the old order. So what I ended up doing was I started looking around in the neighborhood, in the community, for unorthodox ways of actually conducting the R&D. I realized that the inventors, even though they had the ability to work at home in isolation, even when I had, time at a back room in the back of the house that they just kept showing up. Like they wanted to be there. They wanted to make sure they were with other people. They wanted that in-person collaboration. A lot of them were single, and so of course their social lives were just completely disrupted. Especially my CTO now, who I had moved from Maryland, DC area to Pittsburgh, and then essentially shut down his dating life, right, with COVID a month later, right? Um, so I did a couple things to both, alleviate some of the risks and concerns. For instance, I made sure we always had enough food for every possible employee for every meal. That provided a level of continuity that I think is psychological, well beyond our digital era, right? In terms of breaking bread together. Um, and I also went ahead and I found an indoor sports arena, which currently was going through financial trouble. Because of course they couldn't, nobody could play sports, right? It was 4 soccer fields, I think, and like 4 basketball courts and coaches' rooms and all kind of empty space. And I said, this is a place where I can both probably get an attractive rent price, um, have some continuity in terms of the place versus some of the ideas which were like, let's go meet in a park kind of thing and try to work outside, right? Which is fraught with challenges, right? In park pavilions. Or I can go
Especially
to this
since you're
place.
talking about, moving from Maryland to Pittsburgh, so weather becomes a concern, right?
It does, yeah. And then I can go to a sports facility. And so that's essentially what happened was I made sure we had all the meals prepared. I made sure that the guys had a place to go with plenty of space. I gave them all the equipment they could need. And Cyber Crucible, as an invention, as a series of inventions, was born actually on basketball courts and soccer fields and coaches' rooms in a way that I don't think the pace of creativity and the amplitude of the creativity would ever have occurred if I had tried to find some kind of office building and have everyone sit there, in their separate cubicles.
That's so wild. I've got this vision of you guys carting all this equipment, like technology into a sporting arena and people wondering what kind of, CIA operation is is happening there. Right?
Yeah,
One of the things it's really interesting. You talked about the social life part of it, right? Because online shut down the social life. There's this really interesting graph that I saw recently online, and it's one of those sliding graphs where the graphs, the bars change over time, and it talked about where people meet their spouse, right?
interesting.
And at the beginning of the graph, it was like 1930, and in 1930, the number one thing was family, right? People met their spouse through family connections. Not that they were marrying their family. I mean, maybe they were, but but that's what it starts off with.
Like the Habsburgs, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then the graphs go over time, 19 to 2024, and online is like the dominant thing, right? And then friends and family a little bit later, way further down. Really interesting thing. So you talk about social life running down, online shutting, like because the social part of online shut down, they went to the higher form of communication, which is they wanted to be around people, which is really neat. And I think um, that's an interesting thing that happened to your people, and it was neat that you leaned into it. Another thing that you said that you leaned into that I think is really interesting is leaning into discomfort. And I want to riff on this for a second with you. You leaned into the discomfort of everything. I mean, you had to turn into a chef for all these 20 somethings and handle that, but you leaned into the discomfort of everything that you're doing, or you have to submit, right? Like it's either you lean into the discomfort, and I'm almost like sort of discovering this with you. What does that mean to you, leaning into the discomfort? Is that something that you still do? Is this something that COVID's over, right? So what do you
Yeah.
still lean into discomfort?
I still do, I think. And in many ways, the the success of people as they come and go with Cyber Crucible, uh, based on their point in their life, whether that is as an advisor or an employee or a contractor, their success seems to be based and correlated to their willingness to not say no, that's impossible. And because everything about Cyber Crucible is in many ways is all about, taking the rule book and saying, well, I think it's missing a page on this rule book here, and I'm going to figure out what that page is, right? And in many ways, that is what we did. My
What you
background.
did in the soccer field, right? That's what you did.
Exactly. And people, I mean, we've even, we bootstrapped the company almost entirely. We have a couple of really great investors. It's a minuscule amount of money compared to what it costs to run a company and grow an enterprise product to where it is now. And that discomfort is carried through on the corporate side, and on the technical side. My background, when people find out my background later on, I was raised in a house. I think every billionaire has some kind of story where, they were carting buckets of water around from the well, and they didn't have electricity till they were 30, kind of thing. And but realistically, my background, I had a lower middle class family. Sometimes the water did get shut off, sometimes the power, my mom would be racing out there with cash to try to keep the power on, and I found my roots with that, where we're able to take risks in a way that someone who maybe was raised with more comfort or more of a structure, and more balance growing up, they're not willing to give up certain luxuries. And I'm like, man, I remember going to the neighbor's house to take a shower, like, and coming back with a cup of water, right? Definitely not some of these, like, crazy sob stories from, these PR teams put together. But for me, it's like, well, I kind of grew up in discomfort, like, and I'm always able to not go back to that and make my family not go to that situation. So I'm able to dig deeper, I think, than most people. And I found that each one of my engineering leads have had some type of relevance with that story, in their own lives, where they're more willing to take risks because they didn't come from a place where it was an upper middle class or a wealthy lifestyle, right? So
So
they're
they know
they're
what hard really is, right? Like they know.
exactly, yeah. And for them, that just means I'm not going back, and I'm putting my foot down, and I'm going to march forward. And
So,
that's what they do.
so I think you're careful about words. I get that impression, Dennis, and you said willingness to not say no, that's impossible, versus say yes, I can do that. Why did you say it that way? I think there's something behind that.
There is, for every pattern or every invention, there's, 70, 90, 100, whatever number that is, there's a whole bunch of failures. It's just nonstop, right? And even on a sales team, I look at, if they're not failing demonstrably and repeatedly, then that means that there's a lack of energy.
And measurable, right? Like it's got to be
It is
measurable.
measurable.
Yeah.
So, it's not as much as I tried these 25 things that were all off the wall. I thought they would work. Here's my plan. And I don't look back and say, well, you didn't find that one that works, so you're out, like I'm some Steve Jobs or something, right? And instead it was, okay, well, we found 25 ways that didn't work. What can we learn from that? Okay, let's go find the yes, because we found a whole bunch of, well, I won't let the that's impossible hold me down, right? And maybe they didn't work, but we need to get to that yes, I can do it, and I found the way, right? And that's very important. I think even more so than the yes, I know how to do this, because the yes, I know how to do this is more of a late stage company where they're just doing I'll call it like a micro innovation.
So the change is too small, almost, right? All you're also inferring by the choice of words that the leap from where we are to where we're going is conceivable, versus you're saying, I don't know how to get there, but it's not impossible. So I got to find a way. There's a difference
Exactly.
between those two things, right?
There is 100%. Yes.
So you talked, you're really people focused, which is not normal of people who come to it with a technical side, right? They use most technical people have to go and find that. Why are you so people focused? Where does that come from?
That's a really great question. I think potentially part of it is, um, part of it is because when I was in college, essentially, my first foray into being an entrepreneur really was that I was trying to get my first job as like a sophomore in college, my first IT job, and a whole bunch of people, I would call them old guys, more like my age now, maybe even a little bit younger, and they're all getting laid off. It was a layoff period, at least in Pittsburgh, where I was at the moment, right? And I realized, I wasn't gonna get a job. I was like, I'm competing for these like $15 an hour jobs, and there's people there that are like in their 40s with all these certifications. There's no way, right? So I came back and I said, what if I work for you as a contractor? Not even knowing what that really meant and not knowing that the cost savings for some of these companies, looking at, pensions, things like that, that was a very attractive option for them. And that led me into my first business. And of course, that meant that I could not just be a plucky 20 something IT person. I had to learn some people skills and learn them quick. I was on my own in terms of paying the bills, and I had to make sure that I could, pay the rent. And since the revenue is driven by your ability to convince someone to give you money, right, for a service, I realized that I better get a lot better at communication style, at communication skills, and moving forward from there. So it almost shifted to where I could have all the skills I wanted, but I wasn't going to get that IT job, right? I had to be able to speak to people. And I think that's really where that was the origin story for that effort. I will say that since then, when I was hired by NSA, the National Security Agency is an incredible place for a lot of brilliant people. And it's also a place that is really, really hard um, to have a positive like employee culture. Partially because you have all of these mathematician savants and computer science savants who really, people's also not their strength, right? Um, and there's almost like a chasm where we have people who were I'm assuming on the spectrum, who were brilliant mathematicians, uh, but could not even send an email, and on the flip side, you have political hires, who were just brilliant, brilliant statesmen, stateswomen, speakers on the complete opposite of this, spectrum, who ironically could not even be in the same room as this mathematician and hold a conversation, but were just so extroverted and so brilliant in their speech making, right? And so you had this pendulum swing, right?
It's
And
almost
that
like
helped form that,
you're talking about two ends where they didn't lean into the discomfort,
right?
right? So they submitted to just being this quiet expert in what they do, or a loud expert in what they do, never really, I mean, maybe appreciating the other expertise, but never learning how to speak in the other language. One of the greatest paper napkins that we ever got was from a repeat person. Her name was Gina Mollicone Long, and she said, flexibility of behavior is a hallmark of leadership.
Oh,
Leaders learn how
interesting.
to whisper in the language. It's more effective to whisper in their language than to shout in yours. And it sounds like you leaning into discover has taught you how to whisper in other people's language. Would that be right?
I think they'll be very right. Especially when you're around savants on both sides, right? And that. I mean, in my history, and I'm sure everyone else, you only learn you can't yell and be the big boss through failure, right? And you say, man, I really, when you're taking a shower or you're driving on that 4 hour trip to go meet a client, and you think 2 hours in, you're like, holy cow, did I screw up? Like,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that a lot of that came from there. And of course, there were some great examples as well from people. I mean, in the government and intelligence, there are tens of thousands, if not more, of employees across that entire pendulum swing, right? And so there were some great examples that I could follow as well. But you almost had to find them because, like you're saying, they're whispering whenever it's uncomfortable. Very similar, to almost like a Charles Dickens novel. You're like looping back to the very beginning where the folks with the very high EQ, or I'm sorry, IQ, but possibly a little bit introverted, they're not going to be very loud about if they're quietly suffering, or if they're quietly, honestly, if they're also quietly, uh, we'll say exuberant, because they succeeded.
Yeah. So let's talk about these quiet experts though. Like again, finding their art. Once they find their art, they get a little bit louder.
They do, and it's I always uh I like how I find people that don't just sit on their lily pad, you know, because there are people. Well, once you do something great, you can probably milk that for quite a while, right? And what I like is where then it's like, okay, well, I need to get them back to being just comfortable, uncomfortable. Sorry, I have to get them back to thinking of like, that's great, but and I do the same thing in my life, where I have a whole bunch of war stories we can call them, from previous points, and it's like, well, but what have I done lately for the people around me? What have I done lately to achieve my next goal? And so I always keep them focused on fantastic work. That is a great achievement. But what's coming next? Almost like in the Queen's Gambit, I think there was that scene where the one young man wanted to be Grandmaster, and the leading actress was saying, okay, great. Well, then what's next? Like once you get Grandmaster, you have about 60, 80 years of your life left. What are you going to do with it?
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. So let's talk about the other part of this is solution finding team. And you're so people focused and you talked about your onboarding, you talked about your interviewing a little bit, like you just sort of like touched on it. And I want to go back to it. How do you make sure, how do you de-risk that the people that you bring into your team are solution finders, are people who are have this willingness not to say no to that's impossible?
That's a really great question. So there's a couple things that we've tried that have worked. The
And so,
first,
but we should also do this.
yeah,
Your company, by the way, right? Cyber Crucible is in the cybersecurity space, came in the pandemic at a time when cybersecurity was an issue, but you were building the product then. But your company's become regarded like the way that you approach security is very out of the box. It's very different than the norm.
it
So
is.
you've got a very creative solution to a very big problem that is only getting bigger and bigger with AI, more cloud services, more Skynet fears. I mean, if I don't have a Skynet conversation once a day, the sky is actually falling. So
Absolutely.
you're in a cutting edge area and approached in a very unique way amidst global multi-billion-dollar competitors who own the market, like literally own the cloud services market. They can screw up publicly and lose nothing.
And
And
we've seen that.
right, it over and over and over again. And
Yeah,
yet you're finding, recruiting, bringing on a consistent number of people who are saying, not only can we fight those guys, but here's how, and it's totally out of the box. So they're having a willingness not just say no, that's impossible, but also that you're possible, right? Like I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on there. How
there
do you make
is.
sure they're right for you?
That's a great question. It really is. So the um, during the hiring process, uh, we normally go ahead and we have the prospective employee. If they're engineers, it's actually it's more. I think it's more linear if it's an engineering hire, and so I can speak to that a little more strongly. Um, we give them a challenge. Essentially, we find out what they do. We have a good interview, but then we say, "Great, I want you to do this challenge." Now, if they say they are really good at ABC, then we give them say, hey, you know what? Do this little project for me for D. And they're like, well, I haven't done D. Well, I know exactly because every day this is the engineer's path, which is, on the innovation side, which is you have to be a more of a generalist and pick things up. I had a horrible discussion with an investor who really was like, well, you're not steeped in what you made. And I'm like, well, no one is, but that's fine. I know where you're coming from. And I actually wrote a LinkedIn blog just out of frustration. And it's about running a race and, never being an expert. Never being, never sitting on your lofty, in your ivory tower, up looking out the window, but always be letting people be experts in the old, but always growing towards the new, right? So that plays into the interview process. Also, with that challenge, I let them go away and do it.
Hmm.
Um, and what happens is that a lot of the best innovators and learners are sometimes poor communicators, and so that allows them to go in their comfort zone, which might usually honestly be in front of their monitor, away from distractions, and learn. And then what I do with that is I'm able to go ahead and allow them to come back to us with something, right? That, ABC, they're great. D, the project, it limped along all the way, like they dragged across the finish line, but that's fine because that shows us where they're at, and that shows us the tenacity um that they had to achieve to be able to to bring with them, which I can't give them, right? They have to have it, or be willing to fake it, until actually it's real, right? And so that for us was a great interviewing practice. I will say it does take some, we'll call faith-based hiring, and I don't use that to mean like a religious religion at all, but in terms of, I explained to them, this is going to be a place where you're constantly challenged, where you can't just sit in the corner and do bug fixes. You're going to really have to dig deep and constantly reinvent yourself and expand what you think repeatedly, and fail a lot too. And so there's a little more turnover, I think, than what I normally you'd normally expect with a well-structured hiring process. Um, but then, I think bringing on, sales leadership or advisors that can help find that same talent in non-engineering has really helped. You'll see Danny Payhard tags Cyber Crucible once in a while, and he was one of the folks who recognized Palo Alto, which again, another billion-dollar company right now, right? He recognized what they had early on and started selling it like hotcakes because it was the new thing, right?
Yeah.
And he was cornering the market in some ways there.
Yeah, really, really amazing. The other thing that I think that's really good, and it's different in cybersecurity, is that you created this transparency around learning in public, right? As opposed to learning in private. Learning in private is you make a little mistake in your corner and don't share it with everybody else. Learning in public is where you make that mistake out in the open, and you talk about, um, and you hinted at it just there, about not making a mistake somebody's fault. It's an opportunity to learn, and I think that's what you were talking about, right?
Yes, exactly. It also helps us because as a defense mechanism, I mean, I've probably done 2 dozen, 3 dozen things that were new and novel, and they're always bad ideas until someone says they're good ideas and they take credit, right? But like, and what I liked about being in the open is that from a sales and marketing perspective, I've learned that, as I move forward, because something isn't the best idea I could come up with at the moment anymore. Or maybe on a step from A through Z, and I was on M, and M was like state of the art, and then I realized N was better. I guess a little bit like what Iron Man does with the new generations of suit, right?
Yeah,
And someone always came along with another Gen 1 suit, and Iron Man was like, I'm on like Gen 7 now. I don't know what this guy's doing, like,
yeah,
and so I've learned that being open also deflates some of the marketing pizzazz of the folks who are like, look at my Gen 1 suit. It is the best. No one has anything like that ever in the world. There's no other suit out there. And by me having advertised Gen 1, oh, look, now here's Gen 2, here's the improvements here, all the way through, then people can go on YouTube and see, 5-year-old videos of stuff we've done that we're just like, we've moved on, like that's old. And so then that creates tension with people who are following us because they get to see in front of the world, like what they're saying is new and novel and unique. We're like, that was like 5 years ago. Like,
yeah,
that
yeah.
you're not
What are
leaping
what are you
backward.
talking about?
Yeah, and so that helps us there because it doesn't help today Cyber Crucible or today Dennis or today team member. It helps 3 years from now person, right? Because we can go back and say, look what we did then, look how far that we are now in our journey.
It's amazing. There's a You were talking about this LinkedIn post that you made, and there's a poem that jumped into my mind when you started talking about it. And it's called "The Race" by D.H. Grober. and it tells the story of parent child cheering on their son who's in a race, and the first line is, "Quit, give up, you're beaten. They shout at me and plead. There's too much against you now. This time you can't succeed." And the whole like the whole story, moral of the story, the moral of the poem is get up and finish the race. The kid falls over and over and over again, and
Nice.
just keeps on getting up and finishes the race to thunderous applause. The last thing I like about your idea, good idea, they can take the credit. I love it when clients take the credit for the good ideas, because I like answering that with, yeah, we take credit cards. So that's good. They can take the
Right.
credit. We take
That's
their
right.
credit card. That's
That's
fine.
absolutely right.
Yeah. This was great. I want to thank you very much for this. Thanks for coming, Dennis.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate your time.